Good afternoon. I'd like to get started. My name is Todd Worth. I'm the Chief of Police here at Boardman Township. Appreciate everyone coming today. Appreciate Attorney General Dave Yost coming, Omaha County Prosecutor Gina DiGenova. Before we kind of get into the specifics of why we're here today, I wanted to give a little bit of background, which kind of led us here today. In 1972, the body of 12-year-old Bradley Bellino was discovered deceased by employees of a trash hauling company in a refuse dumpster located behind the plaza here in Boardman, again, 50 years ago. Police department worked that case extensively, not only at that time, but throughout the years, following a lot of different leads. A lot of different effort went into that case, not only from Boardman Police Department, but a lot of agencies that support us in that. In 2001, Bellino's clothes were sent to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation's forensic laboratory for testing. A DNA profile was obtained from the evidence left on the victim. And over the years, that DNA profile was put out there to check against several suspects at the time, and also entered into the CODIS National Database, always with negative results. In 2019, Captain Albert Kakasik, who's sitting to my right here, approached me and had a discussion about wanting to revisit the case. And his idea is based on a lot of the familial DNA testing that was happening around the country and the successes a lot of law enforcement agencies had, that he wanted to run with that. This was in addition to all of his other duties and everything else. So as Albert looked at that, we went with a company called Parabon Laboratories, and they do some of this testing. Albert worked with them extensively to review the case. They developed, using the profile that was pulled from Bellino in 2001 from his clothes, developed several different investigative avenues, and we methodically went through those. A lot of officers in our department were part of that process. In many cases, that was done voluntarily by people, by family members, and they were ruled out. In other cases, we had to use other methods to obtain that DNA to rule out those familial trees or branches. At one point, near the end of it, one of our last kind of opportunities, we were able to obtain a final familial DNA sample from a family member of somebody that was a potential subject. The Lee County Sheriff's Department in Georgia assisted us in getting that DNA sample, and we presented that to BCI's laboratory here in Ohio. Not too long after that, in January of this year, we were notified by the laboratory that it was in fact a match, and we were able to identify Joseph Norman Hill Sr. as the subject responsible for that sample, the DNA sample that was found on that victim. Working and presenting with that with the prosecutor's office, we came to the conclusion that we had sufficient evidence to submit to a grand jury, and that we were confident that it would have led to an indictment. Unfortunately, Mr. Hill had passed away in 2019 in California from natural causes, so we weren't able to pursue that any further, but we were able to provide some level of comfort to the family of Bradley Bellino that we had identified the killer, and then also that also put to rest a lot of different theories that we had looking throughout the 50 years of the investigation. I would say that Mr. Hill was not on our radar or part of our case file in any way. He was a Boardman resident, and he worked for Bottle Water Company delivering items. And as we looked at that results of that investigation, it was substantial for us to be able to bring some rest and peace to the family. We revisited another case, and then I'll get to more details about that. So based upon those positive results identifying Hill, we decided to reopen the case. Sergeant Mike Hughes is also at my right, was assigned to work that case. A lot of legwork involved. And again, Sergeant Hughes, just as Captain Kakasik, very busy on a day-to-day basis within our department, was able to do this in addition to his normal duties. Had to very quickly become familiar with a very extensive case file and go from there. So with that results, Bradley's body was found in 1975. David Evans was in 1975, and the body was found approximately 1 mile from where Bradley Bellino's body was found. David Evans lived on Ridgewood Drive in Boardman, and in 1975, at approximately 12 a.m., his father reported his son had been missing most of the evening before. His son was a diabetic, and he had been missing for about 6 hours. David's frozen bodies was found several days later on January 23rd, 1975. It was in the rear yard of a home on Crestline, which wasn't too far from where he went missing. Evans was found lying on his back in below freezing temperatures. One day after the body was found in 1975, Mahoning County Deputy Coroner Dr. William Johnson ruled that the investigation developed no element of criminality into Evans' death, and the immediate cause of death was due to diabetic coma. The county coroner at the time, Dr. Nathan Blinky, also put in his report that since David's death was caused by diabetic coma, there was no physical finding, and there were no physical findings serious enough to cause traumatic death. He ruled that David Evans had died from natural causes. However, during that time, several investigators from Boardman Police Department and surrounding areas, based upon the information at the time, felt that this was a result of a homicide and continued to pursue that investigation very diligently over the years. The autopsy found that the body of David Evans showed fractures to his left radius and ulna, which were suffered after he died, as well as there was a puncture wound in his lower back, which also occurred after death. Even though they ruled it as death by natural causes, the reports does mention that there were multiple abrasions on the child's face, including left eyebrow, right chin, earlobe, and upper part of his back. Evans' clothing were sent at the time to BCI laboratory back in 1975. However, no blood or seminal fluid were found on his clothing. Based upon reassigning the case, Sergeant Hughes worked diligently on several different aspects. He met with the current Mahoning County coroner, Dr. David Kennedy, presented his findings to there. And based upon Dr. Kennedy indicated that Evans being kept from insulin resulted in extremely high blood sugar, which the level ultimately led to his death. The breaking of the ulna and the radius puncture in his back were post-mortem. Based upon this information and other information provided by Sergeant Hughes, Dr. Kennedy formally changed the autopsy result to a homicide. That facilitated our ability to go back to BCI as it classified as a homicide and further test his clothing that we still had in our possession. And as a result of the testing, it was found that a DNA profile obtained off of David Evans' underwear came back to Joseph Hill Sr., also the same individual that we had involved in the first homicide. Both these homicides, 50 and 47 years ago, significantly affected our community. The Boardman Police Department, along with several other agencies, put a great deal of work into it, not only back then, but continuously over the years, revisiting leads as they came to us. Significant to note that Hill, as we've tried to get into his background, we can find no connection between Hill, the subject in these cases, or either one of these young boys who were killed during that time. Numerous suspects were looked at over the years, and there continue to be several different theories put forth of who was responsible for the deaths. Bringing closure to these cases addresses those theories, but I think we all recognize, most importantly, they bring some sense of closure to the families and the friends that are still survived to this day. The death of a child obviously is devastating to anybody, but those taken through a violent act, such in this case, just becomes more tragic. Law enforcement as a whole puts a lot of effort, blood, sweat, and tears into cases like that, and I would say just watching Captain Kasich, Mike Hughes, who I've been friends with a long time, put that work in to get to where we are today is just outstanding. Mahoning County Prosecutor Gina DeGenova is here today, and we'll also make some comments, but I'd like to thank her and her office throughout the years have been part of this process. And as we kind of revisited things, Gina's been nothing but approachable to help us work through this aspect. The Ohio Attorney General's office, I can't say enough about the BCI's laboratory, their investigators, what they do on a daily basis to help law enforcement, specifically Stacy Viola that's here with us today from the lab, and also Erica Jimenez. Both of them worked on each of these cases. And again, the ability for us to be able to pick up a phone as a smaller police department and talk to them on a daily basis, I can't say enough about what that does for not only our department but across the entire state of Ohio. Attorney General Yost, before I turn it over to Gina, I'd just like to thank you personally. I know this cold case aspects of this is a thing that you brought to the office as a focus. And again, we deal with things on a daily basis. I have a lot of our police officers here today that we do the blocking and tackling day in and day out, but when you're able to kind of reach back in a case like this, just has a significant impact on I think, on our morale, on refocusing on what we do on a daily basis. So I'd like to personally thank you for your efforts here. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to Mahoney County Prosecutor Gina DeGenova for some comments.
Good afternoon. First and foremost, on behalf of Mahoney County Prosecutor's Office and myself, I would like to extend our deepest condolences to the family of David Evans and Bradley Bellino. You know, losing a loved one is tremendously difficult, especially when a family has to wait for over 50 years to actually get the answers that they always knew existed. You know, they prayed for these answers, the family of David Evans. You know, you just know. You know, when you have children and a family member, you know in your gut what's really going on here. And they knew. And they knew he was the victim of a homicide, and they wanted to know and have that information for some closure. 50 years later, they got it, and they also got the identity of the person who caused his death. I want to thank our law enforcement partners, including members of the Boardman Police Department and of the Attorney General's office, and commend their dedication. It is because of these fine men and women that the true story of David Evans has finally been revealed here today. As you heard, David was the victim of a homicide at the hands of Joseph Norman Hill Sr. This is the same man, as you also heard, took the life of Bradley Bellino many years ago. Investigating these cases is not easy, and actually was impossible, until certain techniques relating to DNA were developed and refined several years ago. Through these techniques, Joseph Norman Hill Sr. was identified as the person responsible for the death of Bradley Bellino. When this came up, we met with members of the Boardman Police Department. We went over their findings. We went over their case. We met with members of the Attorney General's office. Based upon that information, we were comfortable, myself and my chiefs of criminal were both comfortable that we would be able to present this case to a grand jury, and I was comfortable we would end up getting an indictment if Mr. Hill was still alive. Through these these techniques, we were also presented with the same question as it relates to David Evans. Again, we met with members of the Boardman Police Department and members of Attorney General Yost's office, and were likewise comfortable that with the evidence and the investigation conducted, that we would have been able to present this matter to a grand jury and would have been able to seek an indictment if Mr. Hill was still alive. While no words can bring David back or Bradley back to those who loved him, I do pray that this information will bring some sense of closure to their families. Mr. Hill ruined so many lives. I only wish that he lived long enough to have been brought to justice. May David Evans and Bradley Bellino rest in peace. I would like to now introduce our esteemed Attorney General, David Yost, and turn this over to him. Thank you.
Thank you, Prosecutor DeGenova. Thank you, Chief. Thank you to our law enforcement here in the county that did so much on this case. Appreciate being here today, Chief, for this announcement about the killer, Hill. I especially want to call out two people who've already been named, but I want everybody to know how proud I am of Stacy Viola and Erica Jimenez for their work on these two cases. BCI's, you know, superheroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear lab coats. Our role at the Attorney General's office is not to be law enforcement. It's to help local law enforcement, to provide the support, the logistics, the expertise and forensics, and so forth, to help them do their job. As a former county prosecutor, I know there's too many cases like this out there, cases that detectives and police officers carry with them that they were never able to crack. Cases the prosecutors carry with them and think about in the dark of the night. It's why I created the cold case unit at BCI to deal with cases like this. With the advances in science, we can finally find answers to old mysteries. In particular, DNA technology has come so far, and by that I don't just mean the introduction of DNA, but every few years since the introduction of DNA into the forensic arsenal, there have been new developments. Mitochondrial DNA, the use of family genealogy, advances in being able to analyze imperfect and mixed samples. So cases that even just a few years ago, I'm talking 5 or 6 years ago, were unsolvable by the clues we had. Today, by the miracles of modern science, we can move forward. Why do we do this? Because everybody matters. I want to say a special shout out and thank you, not just to the officers that were involved in these 2 cases, but to all of law enforcement, because the cases we're here about today, while they're exceptional and interesting and newsworthy, the motivations behind those cases are the stuff of every officer on the job every day throughout the state of Ohio. Why would you care about a case that was 50 years old and closed because it was cold and no leads? You do it because justice burns in your bones. That's why you do the job, because you need to. You need to fight for justice. You need to fight for the victims because everybody matters. So my heartfelt thanks go out not just to these officers for a job well done, but to all of their brothers and sisters that are on the job protecting all of us, looking for clues, finding answers to questions that have long ago been forgotten. Thanks, Chief. We'll take questions and try to answer them now.
Is there any reason to believe that, this guy could have killed anybody else, especially with these 2 cases?
So thank you. One of the things that we know about the psychology of serial killers is they don't tend to stop once they've started. It's very possible that there are other cases out there, here, California, somewhere in between along the Killer Hills journey. And if anyone thinks that they might have something, I encourage them to call the Attorney General's office, so I'm sure the Chief would like to hear. But we want to help, and there may be other cases out there we don't know.
So we've done some initial steps led by Captain Kakasik.
Come on over by the mic so I can hear you.
So we've done some initial steps led by Captain Kakasik throughout the process. Approximately 6 years after Bradley Bellino was killed, and it would have been a couple years after David Evans was killed, Mr. Hill moved out to California. He had several addresses, residents out there throughout there. Early on, one of the things that Captain Kakasik had done was coordinate with the Sheriff's Department out there. They had significant resources, San Bernardino County. So we've been in contact with them both over phone. I know the captain has sent out, once we had these second findings, sent out and contacted all the departments that we understand he lived in. His DNA is in CODIS. So if there's a hit on it, but if you're going back to 50, 40 years ago, if there's some evidence of a case that hasn't been tested for DNA that now would be tested. So we're trying that process. And again, like the Attorney General said, we appreciate the resources they have, the expertise they have, full-time staff to kind of help get that word out and look at a lot of different things. So that absolutely is a focus and really is one of the reasons of being here today. Our last press conference, we put out our number. If anybody were trying to get as much background on Mr. Hill as we could, that had lived here, 45, 50 years ago. So that same thing holds true today, why we're here today, trying to continue the investigation. Obviously, these two tragic deaths are solved, but if we can tie his, conduct to anything else, that's a priority of the Boardman Police Department, led by Attorney General's office. That's initiative. That's where it comes into play, where you have, local resources that understand the case because we lived that for 50 years. You have the state resources to support these investigations and kind of a mindset nationally of if we can give some closure to some other family, absolutely. So I appreciate that question.
And let me add just one thing. It's possible that there was a case that was tested 20 years ago for DNA somewhere and got inconclusive results, or they weren't able to draw enough DNA to replicate it to do the analysis. Please, if you're a law officer that is in the sound of my voice and you are thinking, well, that Hill might have been my guy, but we tried the DNA, please call the wizards at BCI. They are doing amazing things that weren't possible just a few years ago. It may be worth taking another shot to see if one of the new techniques, some of the new technology might turn something up that we couldn't even 2005 or 2010.
And it's a great point, sir. This case, my understanding for David Evans, his clothes was tested by investigators right away, even though the coroner had thought that was not cause of death, and it came back inconclusive without anything. As we kind of revisited this after identifying Mr. Hill, that's where it went to the BCI lab, and they were able to pull out that DNA sample or the profile and kind of tie this case. So it's a great point to bring up that everything's always transitioning, so we want to bring some kind of a light to this kind of individual who's involved in the murder. Even though we can't prosecute him, we can't convict him, we can't have officers put handcuffs on him. If we can get this with other things that he's responsible for, I would consider that a great achievement for all of us here.
Is there any connection between him and the 15-year-old boy in 70 that went missing and died?
So we're looking at that, the circumstances, kind of our next step, right? So we're going to revisit that. The circumstances these circumstances were a little different. So we had a coroner saying that he died of natural causes. No DNA came from the test. So we revisited this one based upon this. We're going to again dive into that one. The circumstances, without getting into detail, are a little different, but absolutely, if we can, now go back to that and look and see, that's part of the whole process.
Prosecutor DeGenova, I assume you're working with law enforcement about that. Do you want to address that?
You know what, they have not brought that to us
Yeah,
at
so this is
point, so, yes.
another young man's death that was, how many years after that? Or in
1970.
Yeah, so we had another unsolved death at the time, but again, the injuries were different. Some of the information around the case file is a little different that might lend you to initially think it's not linked to this. But again, we're going to continue to move along.
Typically, too, just to kind of give you a little bit of background about how these matters have been conducted.
Come up over here a
Sure.
second here.
So, Boardman Police, they do their extensively difficult work in their jobs, and they collect the evidence, they go through it, they develop reports, and they'll set up a meeting with us once everything is really finalized and put together and in final form. And then we will meet with detectives, we'll go over the reports, we will meet with the forensic labs, we will go over their DNA analyses, and then we review them, and we see, hey, listen, is this something that we're comfortable that we would be able to bring to a grand jury? And that's where we have made the connection on both of these prior cases. And again, if this case is brought to us, we will do the same and work work with them because, you know, whatever we can do to help bring some closure to these families on these cases that are just so old, you know, is definitely a priority for my office and for me.
I'm going to get the look, but do you have any questions for the investigators or the scientists from the lab? That's a little bit more specific than something that we can answer.
Hill was a truck driver. Have you looked into what his route was, how big of a region he traveled in?
He was a local delivery man for a bottled water company. It's no longer in business. So we've done a lot trying to look into his past, but a lot of the time, you know, has gone. We're not really sure. I don't recall, Captain, his job that he had out in California, what kind of employment he had out there.
He was a local truck driver also.
Local truck driver also. So he was not a our understanding is he was not cross-country truck driver. He local delivery man. And we have no, again, I comment out, we have no indication of any association with him, with Mr. Hill, his family, or the families of these two victims. So we don't know we can speculate, obviously, that kind of reluctant to do so, but he could have come across them in his travels. Both individuals were by themselves when they disappeared. So, but he was not a cross-country truck driver.
And Hill had children of the same age as the children that were deceased in this case, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, they were closer to David, but again, no association, no mutual churches, no mutual schools, nothing that we can tie that family, knowing these individuals.
I know sometimes you, folks in your position will say that, you know, any family members you may have identified of David Waring's don't want to be brought into this. They want to be allowed to, you know, absorb this on their own or whatever. But are there folks that have, you know, you've talked to from the family, and have they said, you know, something about how they feel about what you've done?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So just like 50 years ago, Boardman Police Department was in contact with the victims' families. Continue to be so over the years as we've had detectives retire and different things. Both Mike and Albert have, myself with them, been in contact with the families of both, Bradley and David. They live out of state. They've asked respectfully that they don't want to comment on this function, but they've been very supportive of our efforts. When I say our efforts, I'm saying 50 years. We've passed on to them the work that the Attorney General's office has done and the lab has done in this case. We've talked to them about the Mahoney County Prosecutor's Office, their support. And yeah, there are, obviously some old wounds, but again, there's a lot of theories out there of what happened to them. I think this can put, and who was responsible, I think this puts some rest. But yeah, I would pass that on to the media and stuff in the crowd is, they've respectfully, we've invited them here just as an open invitation. They respectfully declined. They just want their privacy. Obviously it reopens wounds, and now they're back into the mourning the deaths of their, siblings.
I don't think it's probably just me. Is it pretty obvious that these two boys looked a lot alike?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that as investigators we looked at immediately, and that's something that as we push out, this is kind of somewhat of a, at least in, when you have two, it's a trend. I would call this I know there's different definitions out there, but this was very clearly to me a serial killer. He was involved in killing two boys. These two had no relationship to each other. They had no relationship to him. To me, that's the definition. I'm not going to get into numbers of 3 versus 2 or 4 versus 2, but you can see kind of a profile here, and it could have been just a matter of circumstances. He came across two boys that were by themselves, but that's something that law enforcement, and again, that's where you're bringing in the expertise of the state investigators, the expertise of other federal agencies to look at profiles and different aspects for that. But yeah, that's something that struck us as well.
With the evolution of DNA, how does that shift your focus now to other cold cases?
I put that out to the experts here. I mean, they live this every day, and I made that comment. I'm not kidding. We pick up the phone, and they're answering. They're running hard, working hard. Boardman Police Department is very active police department. We have very active detectives. We have right now temporarily, BCI is actually doing intake of the evidence for our area out of one of the offices as they get new space here. And we welcome it with open arms because it's just that support. I think, like we've talked about a couple different ways, look at old cases. In this case, we found no DNA evidence, resubmitted that, 40-some years later, new techniques, new expertise, but I would defer the question to them of maybe what they're seeing. But I just can't say enough of, we're not solving this case without them, without the support of the Attorney General's office. And we're not solving this case without the diligence of the detectives that worked this before. And like I said, Mike and Albert both, hey, do your job every day, and then also work on this. So across the board. I keep trying to have one of these four kind of say something, or you guys direct the question to them. So,
Mr. Attorney General, how important is it for the state to continue to fund these efforts of these cold cases?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
How important is it for the state to fund the efforts of these cold cases?
Yeah, so it's not just cold cases, but it's a matter of scale. So DNA labs are expensive. Boardman is better off than a lot of township police departments, but I doubt that they could afford to finance and accredit a lab and employ a scientist to do this kind of work. So the state exists because it has the scale to help out on these thankfully rare cases. Without the state doing the cold case support, without the state bringing in the cyber, the DNA, the chemistry analysis, there are lots of cases all across this state that the bad guys would never be brought to justice. It's absolutely critical. It's a prime mission of the state government to support local law enforcement.
Another question, Mr. Attorney General. Would the state, as well as you, support more funding and outside-the-box approaches like podcast investigations?
Which kind of investigations?
Podcast investigations. You see these true crime podcasts out there now.
I think that we take leads wherever we find them, whether it's in the media or the podcast universe that's suddenly sprung up. At the same time, not everything that makes good entertainment is necessarily a solid investigation. These investigators have been highly trained, spent a lifetime gathering their expertise, and candidly, when a podcast or a media thing catches their attention and says, wow, that's a place we ought to go, then we're ready to help. Should the state be jumping on every axe that's grinding from a podcaster? You need a $120 mic and a laptop to start a podcast. While they're very interesting, they're no match for many of them are no match for the experienced professional investigators in law enforcement.
And I would imagine that Prosecutor DeGenova and you being a county prosecutor, the policies, processes, procedures, the training we have to solve a case. Let's say that this individual turned out not to have been deceased. So we now have to go from investigating, identifying the individual to prosecuting the person. And sometime, making sure that we're using our procedures, policies, and everything else that are tested in court lends to that, what the Attorney General is saying, that where we always take information and we always facilitate information that comes in, but when it comes down to it, it's a focus of an investigation of how we'd conduct any of our investigations that we'd bring to Prosecutor DeGenova to say, hey, here's our case, this is what we've proved, we want to prosecute. So that comes into play, I think, with these podcasts. The nice thing is it generates a lot of interest, and it generates maybe leads and theories and stuff, but these guys are the ones that have to sort through all that too. So, do a couple more questions here. Go ahead, sir.
I'm not sure any of us are in this room or here in the 70s, early 70s to know firsthand, but did the investigation uncover that these murders created a great deal of concern within Boardman at that time?
Yes, there
Defer to
was
Mike.
a great deal.
Come on up here.
Mike, go ahead, you get to stand up and come over here. It was hard enough getting him in a suit and tie today.
But he wears
There-
it well.
There was quite a bit of turmoil over the finding of the death of David. There was a big push to rule it a homicide from the public. So yes, it caused great concern. There was letters to the Vindicator, to the editor, saying and requesting more to be done. The father of David actually contacted President Ford's office, asking for the FBI to be involved, and the FBI declined due to jurisdiction issues, but it went on and on for a period of time.
And in 1971, 72, whatever, this would have been a very rare type of thing. I mean, it would be rare now, I guess, but.
Yeah, obviously, it was a great concern because we had two young boys dead in a very short period of time, and with similar type of situations. As you said before, they do resemble one another. They're about the same age. They're a year difference. Their build was about the same, and there was great concern in the community that we had two dead young boys.
People probably kept their children closer to home after that.
Actually, there was letters to the newspaper about that. We're not letting our children play outside anymore. This was all in the case file. The officers in 1975 did a really good job on this. They worked really hard on this, even though it was ruled a natural death, but they investigated it as a homicide. But yeah, there was a great concern amongst the community.
Other questions? We'll stay after for a little bit. If there's additional questions, I'll take maybe one more if you have one. If not, we'll go ahead and conclude the briefing. Again, I just wanted to thank Attorney General Rios for making the trip out here, Prosecutor DeGenova. Again, we do this stuff every day, law enforcement, a lot of officers here in this room, daily looking at how can we make our community safe. This obviously is long overdue, but I think it's why we put resources like this in this. So thank you again, sir, for coming. Thank you, ma'am. And like I said, we'll stay here for a little bit for questions.
Hi everyone, I'm Lindsay Watson. Thanks for watching the WKBN 27 First News YouTube channel. If you want more video news, subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the WKBN 27 First News app for breaking news alerts.